Welcome back to the Applied Leadership Podcast. My name is Brandon. This is my partner, Blaine. We are excited to be with you guys and just tackle questions and discuss them and figure out what do we think about them, big topics in leadership. So we got a really great question today. And the question is, how do you reconcile the difference in perspective between leaders making decisions and frontline workers doing the do? And in addition to that, what are your thoughts on the emotional toll required from both parties?
Okay. This is sort of like the all-encompassing question of leadership in many ways, right? Like, how do we get the people who are, in charge of or responsible for the organization and the decisions that kind of steer the organizations, how do we make sure that they are in touch with and doing a good job supporting, acting on behalf of the people that are right there where the rubber meets the road, that are kind of doing the work, turning the wrenches, interfacing with the customers, that kind of thing. In many ways, that's the whole game. But maybe we could try to neck this down into smaller pieces. Is the idea here that we're trying to get at reconciling their perspectives to ensure that good decisions are being made? So, people clearly have a view or a perspective on the organization based on where they sit. Do we want to start there and sort of this idea of maybe combining or reconciling perspectives?
Yeah, I think we could probably start there, because I think with a lack of some effort to both acknowledge perspectives, you start to see some of the friction, and you start to see some of, when the question comes across of what do you think of the emotional toll involved, my sense is that underneath that there's probably some friction that is starting to emerge. So I think that starting with where you're going, Blaine, in terms of like, can we even acknowledge that there are different perspectives, might be a good place to begin.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is like, maybe before we start worrying about, reconciling or representing any particular view or perspective, maybe we just press the pause button and say, hey, let's just get comfortable with the idea that we're all doing our best and we're all approaching this through our own kind of unique lens, right? We're, trying to tackle problem situations, strategies, decisions, but we only have our particular view on it. And so it's okay that the way, you think this policy should go might be a little different than the way I think the policy should go, because, we're probably looking at it from two different angles. And so I guess that's probably step one, is just, as an individual, acknowledge that. And I would say, anything you can do organizationally to make that an okay thing. In other words, talk about this whenever there's, a conflict or something that arises. Can you, over enough time, through enough reps, kind of convince your team, your people, your organization that, hey, this is okay. This is the way it is. And so if the time comes where we run up against something that we're not seeing it the same way, like, that's just normal, and go from there. And there's probably a million ways you could do that, but I think being the kind of leader that can just sort of say, yeah, okay, no problem. Let's chat about it a little bit, because it's fine for us to have different views on this, at least to start.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it reminds me of how important acknowledging trade-offs is in the life cycle of any organization, right? Like, you could have differing perspectives from someone who's closer to the problem, the frontline, perspective, from somebody that's, call it, at the executive level. And I think what you're suggesting is that we want to create an environment, a culture that enables those perspectives to come forth. Help me understand what you're seeing closer, to the fire, so to speak, closer to the heat here. And also, are you willing to hear what I'm seeing from the organizational perspective? And this is where that, this is a little bit dead center of one of the modules that we have shared with a number of organizations on creating a common operating picture, right? Which, one of the key things that we talk about all the time is that, look, the ground truth closest to the heat, so to speak, is not the whole truth. And the broad truth, call it the perspective of the executive or the leader, is not the whole truth. The broad truth and the ground truth is the whole truth. That's how we get to that. Right. And I think it's important that we create those environments, because otherwise that is where that friction comes about. And that's something that we also share in that same context is, look, if we're not figuring out a way to connect in some way, we're going to lock up, right? That's friction, right? We're going to lock up. But conversely, if we can figure out that a way that is culturally acceptable, that is effective, where we can gather the ground truth, so to speak, and we can gather the broad truth and figure out where that whole truth is, well, that might just keep us in tension while still recognizing, look, you might not agree with everything. Like you might say that this procedure adds X amount of time to my workday, and if I add the X amount of time to my workday or this process, then it frustrates my ability to do other things. And yet it still might be that change still might be overall in the benefit of the organization, which takes us back to trade-offs, where we might have to say, hey, I get it, and I understand that we're going to have a little bit of diminished productivity, call it, or effectiveness on this side of the equation, and we really actually need what benefit this is going to garner us on the other side of the equation. It's a trade-off.
Yeah. And I think in order for people to be okay with some of these trade-offs that have to be made, there are a couple of things that need to be in place. One of it is kind of dispositionally, and I think leaders have to model this, is this, being curious and humble with what you know and what you don't know, right? And I think that has to start with the leader. You've got to be genuinely curious about what you're not seeing, what you don't know, what might be going on that can be helpful, and humble enough to know that, it's oftentimes someone closest to the problem will have a better solution to that problem. So I think that just having that disposition is important, but that's a little fluffy. I would say the other thing that has to happen that's a little bit more tactical is you've got to have mechanisms for consistent communication, throughout the organization. And we work with tons of leaders, and one of the things we coach almost all of them to do is to communicate with more frequency, with more clarity, through more mediums than they usually are. And a lot of leaders are just good, solid, humble people, and their natural inclination is that people don't want to hear from you that often, And what we tell most of them is that's not true. Your people actually want to hear from you a lot more than you probably think. And if there's something that's important to share, like let's say your perspective on an upcoming initiative or strategy or something like that, if you can share that in a memo, great. If you can share it in an email, great. If you can share it in a 2-minute recorded video, great. At a live town hall, great. Via text message, do it, because everyone's going to receive information differently. A lot of people are going to, brush off the first time they see something. But if you're the kind of leader that is proactively and consistently and, put in a little work to try to write with as much clarity and concision as you can, if you're consistently sharing with people your perspective, what you're thinking, where your head's at, people are going to be a lot more amenable. They're going to warm up much more quickly to what it is you might have to say, even if it's not the first thing that comes to their mind, right? And then again, as the leader, you probably need to build mechanisms by which people can share their perspectives from the front line, right? Some people are just more inclined to share away. Those squeaky wheels down there that we all need in our organizations, those are great, but those are the exceptions, right? And sometimes the loudest voice isn't the wisest voice. Many times it's not. And so the other obligation you have as a leader is, what mechanism can you have in place, or number of mechanisms are in place for folks to share their perspectives, bubble up a problem, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think a posture of curiosity and humility is important to model. But I think having no kidding mechanisms where there is really consistent communication in all directions is what's actually going to make it work or not.
Yeah, I mean the importance of feedback loops both
Yeah.
formal and informal feedback loops. So critical to this entire process. I mean, critical to leadership. I wonder if that's where some
I'll
of
throw one more thing in here then, since I had two things. No, go ahead.
no go.
Well, I was going to say that there's this concept. It's not really a concept. It's pretty straightforward, but something I think about a lot is the idea of informed decision making. And if we're speaking right to the leaders here, we know that you have to make decisions, and we know that everyone's not always going to agree with the choice that you make. You may even feel conflicted from time to time, between multiple options, but you're going to have to make these decisions. That's your job. That's actually what you get paid for, is to decide on these trade-offs and make decisions, set direction. And I think the way to do that and sleep at night is to make informed decisions. And I find that kind of on the sweet spot in the mean between, you don't want to be making isolated decisions. Like, I don't want anyone's feedback. I'm just going to think really hard about this and make a decision. That's clearly not the answer most of the time. But what we see an awful lot, actually, is leaders that want to make decision by consensus. I mean, they don't want to upset anybody. They want everyone to feel heard. They want everyone's input to be accounted for. And next thing you know, you end up making these really suboptimal decisions because you're trying to optimize for every variable or for every person's perspective. And in some ways, if we're being honest, we're also kind of getting that burden off of our shoulders a bit, because you were like, well, we all made this decision. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's not the role of the leader. The leader is, responsible for making the decision and saying, hey, I made this decision. I feel as good about it as I can. We're gonna execute. But I've taken as much feedback and as many perspectives into account as I can, and I really think this is the way to go. There's that really sweet spot in there of making an informed decision that wasn't done in isolation, but also wasn't done by committee.
Yeah, I think something you just mentioned reminds me also of another very common situation that we see with folks trying to get that committee effect, which is that analysis paralysis. It's the constant, well, we have to hear from this, we have to hear from that, we have to hear from here, we have to hear from there, we have to hear all of this. And that's a decision by not making a decision. That is a rate limiting factor, right there. That goes back to, the old, patent, an 80% plan now executed relentlessly is better than a 100% plan later. And I think that does tends to end up being a little bit of a defense mechanism for leaders as well. Like, well, I mean, I just didn't want to make the call because I didn't have all the voices involved. I think that the frame of informed decision making, we did the best that we could. We operated in earnest. We engaged with formal and informal feedback loops. We gave people the opportunity to input their perspective on this, and made the best decision that we could make at the time. So now we need to operate. We need to execute. Maybe this is where that natural, the question, the second half of the question then became, how do you deal with the emotional toll? This may very well be kind of the sweet spot where we as leaders might feel that emotional toll. I mean, let's just start by thinking into that process. Like, it might feel a little scary to just flat out say, I got to make the decision, and I'm making the decision. That could be scary.
Right. That does sound scary. And while I totally agree, I think if you look at the alternatives, they're worse emotionally over time. While it might not spike, your anxiety as much in the moment, the chronic stress and anxiety you're going to feel by using the alternatives is going to add up and be way worse. But what I mean by that is, if you feel like you have to make decisions in isolation, like, this is me, I've got to make this decision, it's all on my shoulders, you're going to flame out. Like, that is too much stress. That is not a way to go. But on the other end, if you feel like, every single voice has to be incorporated into every single decision, and it's got to be perfect, we got to wait for all the best information. I mean, if you're putting that level of burden on the quality of your decisions or that style of decision making, you can't sustain that over time either. Like, you'll just never get anything done, for one thing. But for two, you'll just be so stressed because like no matter what decision you make, there's going to be at least one person who's not fully happy with it, probably a lot of people. And if you let that eat you up because your standard was, everybody's perspective was incorporated equally in this and everyone's going to be happy with it, I just don't think there's any way to do that as a leader. At some point, you've got to convince yourself that you're making the best decision you can at the time with the information you have everyone's best interest in mind, and you're going to go with it. And your ability to own that and do that time and time again is, in the moment when you have to sort of like push the button or pull the lever on that decision, it may feel very stressful. But over the long haul, you're going to have a much less stressful life. And the other thing is, people are going to give you more benefit of the doubt. They're going to better understand your process. And they're going to grumble a lot less if it doesn't go exactly their way, because they're at least going to appreciate that you're owning your decisions, that you're getting paid the big bucks, because that's the stress that you're willing to take on. And I think people are a lot less likely to nitpick, and they're a lot more likely to kind of execute and move out when they know that you're doing that consistently. So maybe it's a matter of, are you willing to take a little bit of the stress now to have kind of a lower overall level of stress kind of in perpetuity?
That makes a lot of sense. I wonder if we could kind of explore, what about the emotional toll or the experience of the frontline worker? How do we think about that? So or even a frontline leader. Here I am. I'm closer to the heat. I'm closer to the front line. A decision's been made. I don't fully agree with it. What do I do with that? And I think that, one place to start with this is, I think this is real agency space, right? This is the agency to look at this and say, okay, am I willing to even consider all of the variables involved? Am I willing to even look at this? And I'm using the word willing intentionally, because I think oftentimes it can be very easy to get so locked in that we are unwilling. And that is a matter of agency, to say like, well, I'm not willing to consider an alternative. Like I'm the person that has the expert, voice on the ground. I said that you shouldn't do this. You did it. And maybe I'm not willing to come off of that. What's that say about me? I don't know. Like, we could really start to dig into this, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So there's certainly that. And I think part of it is, what do you do with that decision? I think where we run into real problems, and maybe we can think more about how to soothe some of this perhaps, but I think where we for sure run into problems is in a couple of areas. One is if somebody intentionally undermines a decision or a course of action, or they kind of half step it, they don't really try because they've decided that they prefer to see this fail so that they could sort of be proven right. I understand the human nature involved in that, but that is for sure a recipe for disaster. And I think you and I both know this because we've worked kind of at all levels across lots of different organizations, that the person who chooses to do that, eventually people get it.
Yeah.
And they see that. And you're not going to increase your value to the organization because you were right about the decision. You're going to decrease your value to the organization because you're someone who chose to sort of undermine or not get on board with the decision that was made. So I think that's something we have to point out right away. The other thing that can really negatively impact an individual and an organization is if you just sort of quietly begrudge, bemoan, resent the decision,
gossip,
and you don't offer anything up, right? So we don't want that either. If you see something or a decision was made that you think was poorly informed or isn't going to work, or you're on the ground doing it and you can see that it is not working, we don't want you to stay quiet and say, this is not my job, I just work here. That's not what we're going for. I do think we want to raise our hand or, send an email or talk to your manager, pull somebody off to the side, whatever you can do. Again, you can be thoughtful about this. You can be considerate about it. You can be professional about it. But you probably need to say, hey, I've been doing this thing this way for the past 3 or 4 weeks. And there are some obvious challenges to this that I think people should be aware of. In that case, something can potentially be done about it. But if we're quiet, resentful, or actively undermining, not only are we going to harm the organization, but I'm fully convinced that we're just going to harm ourselves as an individual, because over time, that kind of behavior gets kind of sniffed out, and you're not going to be a go-to person by any stretch.
Yeah, we talk to a lot of leaders across the country, and nearly unanimously they say, what I wish for my team members to do is to thoughtfully bring up an issue, or give me like a proposal, give me an alternative, give me a, like, articulate a business case. If we've made a decision and we're not clearly seeing how it's fully impacting, the work that you're doing, help me understand, but not by actively undermining what I'm doing or what we are doing, not by dissenting, so to speak. Do the work, continue to execute. If it's not working, then help me understand by articulating a business case. Help me understand, like, what's the issue. In the military, we always talked about issue, discussion, recommendation. Look, here's the issue. We made this decision. I suggested it would be detrimental in some way. Let me give you a couple of factoids that I've collected over the last 4 weeks, because I've actually done what you asked me to do. I did exactly what you asked me to do, even though I didn't agree with it. I aligned to it. And here are some indicators that I want to bring to your attention that are becoming problematic. Oh, and by the way, here's a recommendation that I have.
Yeah, so this is excellent. I think part of executing in earnest is that it gives you a couple of real advantages here. So first of all, in the kind of vein of which you're describing this, if you're doing it to the best of your ability and it's not working, then you actually know it's not working, because you tried your best. You did it sort of as prescribed, and it's not working out. And so now you actually have valuable information. There's some real learning there that can be useful to others, because it's real, versus if you were just kind of half-stepping it, undermining it, not really doing it. Well, if it's not working, what have you really learned? What do you really know there in terms of the plan, the strategy, the approach, right? So there's that. The other thing that could happen is you might be surprised, and maybe it does work, right? And so if we're willing to be kind of proven wrong,
Yeah.
then that's a positive outcome too. So maybe, from your perspective, this wasn't the way to go, but if you do your best and it works, and it's like, guess I wasn't right about that, and this does work. So you and I have both seen this a lot in hiring, right? And this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's related. There are lots of times when you're hiring, especially in a small business, and you don't have a super robust like HR mechanism.
Yeah.
And you've got someone in mind for a gig, and you want to open up that role, and you want to bring in this person because they're going to be perfect for it. And I see a lot of hesitance in kind of going through the full process, because we kind of want this person, and we're afraid that if we open it all up, then it's going to take time and effort, and it's going to like muddy the waters, so to speak, or we might accidentally end up with the wrong person. There's a lot of like hesitance around this. And I think what we found many, many times over is that there are only positive outcomes to that process, because if the person you thought was a slam dunk was in fact the best person for the role, that will emerge through a really rigorous process, and you're only going to feel that much better about the person that you thought was good in the first place. So that's good. That's a win. That's a net positive. Now you feel great about bringing this person in. And if someone else emerges in the process that is actually a better fit for the role, then you've got a person that's a better fit for the role. Like, the only downside is it might take some time and energy. But in terms of outcomes, there are only good outcomes by sort of doing it the right way or challenging your preconceived notions. And so I would say, even if you're a frontline leader or you're an individual contributor that's interfacing with customers or software or whatever, there's really no downside other than a little bit of effort and time to sort of doing it, sort of the prescribed way, because you're either going to learn truly what works and what doesn't, or you're going to figure something out that's maybe a better way. So why not? Give it a shot.
Yeah, I can't help but be reminded of many years ago, as we were really building Team Red, White, and Blue. We were looking for a grant manager. We thought we knew exactly what we needed. We went through the process. We worked the whole process through. And you remember, I came back after all was said and done, and I said, I got to actually hire 2 people. Like, I got to hire two people, one of which being Sarah Holzhab, who is our, amazing teammate now. We couldn't not hire her. All of us were like, of course we have to figure this out, which takes on risk. That is risk. And again, you want to talk about emotional toll. Like, I get it. You take on risk, but once again, you make the best decision possible with the information that you have at the time. We worked the process, and new insights emerged in the midst of the process because we were willing to actually do it instead of be so locked in, so confirmation bias oriented on what we thought was going to happen.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's one of my favorites of all time. So maybe to sort of wrap this up a little bit and summarize, I would say that if you are the leader, clear, consistent communication in all directions, you doing it yourself and creating mechanisms for that to happen can nip a lot of this in the bud. I think modeling a posture of curiosity and humility will go a long way. I think owning the decision-making process, but making informed decisions versus isolated and by committee is really important. And then we kind of got to the individual contributor, and I think where we came to was, have a voice, do it professionally, do it respectfully, add something positive, and be willing to execute and learn, because the only way we can really, know whether something's working or not is if we're giving it our best effort to kind of give it a go. And I think where that really lands for that person that's frustrated, and we get it, is you're going to make yourself an asset to the organization in the long run, even if you're a bit frustrated, sometimes in the short run. And that's where you want to be. There's no point in being proven right, only to be kind of a negative person within the organization. So, take that opportunity, take that agency, I think, which is the word that you used. Do your best, have a voice, and trust that in time, I think these things are going to work themselves out, and the value you bring is going to get recognized.
Definitely. And the last thought that I would add to this that is most particularly oriented to the idea of emotional toll, because look, leadership is hard, especially when you care, is I think that is a much longer and deeper conversation about what we do to get left of bang, as we would say in the military, before the moment of impact. What are the things that we're doing to prepare ourselves? How are we taking care of ourselves? Physical, mental, spiritual, emotional health aspects. What are the relationships that we have in place that will buoy us against those difficult times? What is our sense of purpose? All of these things. And in moment of impact, how do I deal with this thoughtfully? And post moment of impact, how do we then recover from it? So definitely a longer conversation for another day. But thank you so much for the question. If you guys want to drop us a question, please just shoot it over to operations@appliedleadershippartners.com, and we'll see you the next time around.